Hello, cooking enthusiasts. This week's video should be a slightly shorter one. I wanted to quickly go over a little seasoning mixture I came up with that I really like, and I will probably be featuring in a number of future recipes and videos. It's a mixture of Italian dried herbs with two types of toasted seaweed slash kelp. I feel like, to a certain extent, dried herbs have kind of fallen out of favor, but I still find them very useful for certain applications. This mixture I'm making works really well for seasoning basic proteins, for adding toward the beginning, like a soup or a stew or a sauce, but it can also be really good to finish a dish. With the sort of Asian influence, this is definitely inspired by furikake, but without the sesame seeds or direct salt, sugar, etc. Although you could easily go in that direction as well. Now, the first thing you are seeing is toasting fennel seeds, and this was actually processed by my grandmother from her garden, so it's kind of fennel seeds, but also some bits of like dried herb leaf material. So obviously, I'm pretty spoiled for dried herbs, but you should be able to source some decently fresh dried herbs from a good local source. These ones I'm working with right now are actually probably over a year old, so I'm due for some new stuff, but they still get the job done. Once the fennel is toasted, it's time to move on to the first type of seaweed slash kelp. So this is dried kelp, aka kombu in Japanese cooking, or I believe dashima in Korean. To be honest, I've played around with it a decent amount, and I'm actually not super enthusiastic about it as a ingredient for since I started using it more like a dried spice, I have liked it a lot more. In this case, we are toasting it to both develop a really nice kind of nutty flavor and to drive off a few last bits of moisture. Even though it is quite dehydrated, it's not necessarily going to turn into a powder super easily. We basically toasted until most of the pieces turned a sort of yellow color. If you were able to do this over a little fire, that would probably taste even better. Because the fennel seeds and the kombu are both pretty hard, we want to break those down all the way to a fairly fine powder, which just takes a little bit of work in a spice grinder. Because everything else in the mixture is much softer, we're going to try and preserve some slightly larger textures. After that, it was just about quickly toasting some nori seaweed. Again, this is exactly what you would use for sushi. Again, the toasting is mostly for flavor, but also to help it dry out and crumple a bit better. I don't mind the taste of nori, but again, it's one of those things that I much prefer once it's been toasted. Again, once toasted, we had to break it down in several batches. I was going for fine flakes of nori, but not necessarily powder. Although, if you prefer that look, you definitely can go all the way to powder. Once we were on the last batch of nori in the spice grinder, we started adding the rest of the Italian dried herbs. The remaining ingredients are dried basil, dried oregano, and dried marjoram. The basil and the oregano are from my grandmother, but the marjoram I had to buy. I feel like dried marjoram is a pretty underutilized herb. I don't see it in many recipes or in many stores, but I do highly recommend going out and trying to source it. The flavor is sort of like a dried thyme, but maybe a little bit citrusy. If you absolutely can't find it, you could leave it out of the recipe or substitute with lemon thyme or regular thyme. Again, we are just blitzing up the dried herbs a tiny, tiny bit more. We don't want total powder. But from there, that is about it. Again, this is a little mixture I'm going to be referencing many times in my future videos, so I highly recommend you give it a try or something similar to this. I have the exact measurements I used in the video description, but you may want to make a smaller scale batch because this recipe makes quite a bit, and I encourage you to experiment using it in all types of dishes or making your own similar spice blends. If you have any questions about this or anything else, please leave them in the comments. Also, do consider sharing, subscribing, and liking. It really does help out. Otherwise, thank you for watching.